World of Warcraft. It's been around really since 2004. That was the launch of the game. I've been playing WoW since 2005. I was 15 years old. 15-year-old, puberty and, running through my veins and logging into WoW for the first time. Little did I know, changed my life at gaming forever. Let's take a little nostalgic look back at World of Warcraft. What playing Warcraft was like in 2002. Let's see what this video is all about here from Necro.
There's a popular saying that what goes on the internet stays there forever. The common belief is that once something hits the internet, it's there forever, but that's not always true. Countless videos, screenshots, audio clips, and other digital content have been lost for years, sometimes permanently.
Yeah. 2002 would mean he was playing like PTR or something. Like there was beta and alpha testing for World of Warcraft, so that's if he played WoW in 2002, it was alpha or beta.
Thanks to dedicated archivists and passionate fans,
2002 Warcraft
pieces
maybe
of Warcraft history have been recovered.
Instead
In this
of World
video,
of Warcraft.
I'll share some fascinating stories of lost Warcraft media that players have managed to rediscover and preserve over time. Let's go back to 2008, when Wrath of the Lich King was set to bring bold, ambitious ideas to World of Warcraft. Yet, for various reasons, some of these intriguing concepts were eventually scrapped by the developers. Some simply couldn't be finished in time for release, while others deviated too drastically from the established gameplay mechanics. An idea that likely resonated with many Warcraft enthusiasts was tied to the Winter Grasp. Beyond the conventional siege engines that players were familiar with, the zone was also meant to feature aerial combat vehicles. For the very first time in the game's history, these flying machines would have been used for player versus player battles. At the time, the concept seemed both ambitious and genuinely
exciting. Could have had flying
exciting.
vehicles?
In practice, however,
I had no idea this was a thing. What the hell? So flying combat would have been a thing. You guys remember we were supposed to get mounted combat in Wrath of the Lich King 2? Instead, all we got was like the jousting stuff that ended up coming out with the Argent Dawn campsite thing. That would have been fun. We even had a jousting boss fight, if you remember, in that one.
It proved to be rather dull, leading to its eventual removal before the expansion's official release. I'm sure you've heard similar stories in many videos about cut game content. To our great fortune, a single piece of footage showing how this system looked and functioned from a player's perspective was preserved in the depths of the internet. This footage of flights over the Winter Grasp was published by an individual on an old Warcraft fan website.
Could have had dogfights, yeah.
Just a few months before the expansion's release, when the beta was in full swing. To my knowledge, this remains the only known footage of how the original Wintergrasp air combat system actually worked. In the video, the player demonstrates the various machines that never made it into the live game.
We were supposed to get mech suits?
Let's take a closer look at what was scrapped. First, there was the Shredder. Players would enter it just like any regular siege machine. It possessed several abilities: firing rockets at a target, attacking players in melee with its saws, and performing a small sudden forward jump. There was also the option for a much larger jump, which theoretically would have allowed it to traverse high obstacles. And of course, it had an acceleration ability. Now, onto the flying machines. The first flying vehicle had 3 abilities. The first was to launch rockets in a single direction, meaning without being tethered to a specific target.
This kind of would have been fun, but I mean, one reason why maybe they didn't do this, you guys remember Wintergrasp had a lot of lag issues, especially because that thing could fill up with as many players as there was no limit. It was an open world zone, man. I loved Wintergrasp. As scuffed as it was at times, I really still think that was some of the most fun I ever had PvPing in the game. Wintergrasp was awesome. But that shit used to lag like crazy at times. So you can imagine lagging in the air and then, adding aerial combat on top of the lag that was already happening on the ground. Yeah, this shit would have been broken as hell. But I kind of wish they would put it in because it's kind of cool.
Ability was to accelerate. Next up was the Bomber, a more interesting machine. Like the previous one, it could also fire rockets in a general direction.
Yes, Haas, I remember that storm.
It had an ability called Chaff, which masked the War Machine and prevented it from being attacked for 5 seconds.
Yeah, it's crazy actually. WoW lagged less back then. You're right, Justin. Now WoW lags with 20 people in a raid. That's true. Back then, it used to take like 100 people in Wintergrasp to cause lag.
I'd describe it as something akin to heat flares in other games, but adapted for the Warcraft universe. Finally, the most important ability, which truly justified its Bomber moniker, was the deployment of Napalm. The Bomber would emit flames onto the ground below, dealing damage to anyone caught within its fiery embrace.
Oh my god, that would have been so... Could you imagine carpet bombing an entire group of people with napalm? Oh, this would have been awesome.
simple. Nothing prevented players in these aircraft from flying directly into the fortress itself. So, what can we conclude based on this salvaged
Kamikaze
footage?
yourself?
It actually makes much more sense why the developers decided to remove this system. The aerial combat felt clunky, unwieldy, and utterly unrealistic. While Warcraft doesn't demand realism
What's
in
up,
every
Tundra?
small detail, as one of Warcraft's lead developers, Tom Chilton, once put it, it's quite strange when you can crash a plane into the ground and nothing bad happens. These aerial vehicles flew slowly, and hitting players with rockets would have been incredibly difficult. Since the first aircraft was likely designed to fight airborne enemies too, hitting flying targets with already clunky rockets would have been even more frustrating.
Would have been
It would have
janky.
been great if the developers had turned this concept into something playable and fun, but in the end, it's probably for the best that it was scrapped. Starcraft greatly boosted Blizzard's popularity among RTS fans, but back in the 1990s, it looked almost identical to Warcraft. After the success of Warcraft 2, Blizzard began working on a new strategy game set in a different universe. Initially, it was a modest project planned for release in 1996. Due to tight deadlines, the early version
I
of
didn't know this.
Starcraft closely resembled Warcraft 2, even sharing a similar user interface. The color palette, unlike the final retail version, was far more vibrant, garish, and almost toxic in its brightness. For instance, the Zerg units simply glowed with a brilliant purple hue.
Jesus.
The minerals,
It's
which
hard
in the
to look
released
at.
game are found on solid ground, were depicted floating mysteriously in space. These rare glimpses of the early StarCraft version were showcased at one of the ancient gaming exhibitions. It's safe to say that these few frames are almost the only remnants we have of that very early concept. The public reaction was less than enthusiastic.
Why is there StarCraft
The
in this
game was
video?
mockingly dubbed Orcs in Space. This poor reception was partly because the developers had very little time, but were obligated to present something at the exhibition. Samwise Didier,
birthday,
one
my
of
guy.
the company's
Thanks,
principal
Snoopy.
artists, described the situation retrospectively. I remember that period like, oh god, E3's coming up, we gotta do something. So we just made whatever. The incredibly lukewarm
Jeez.
reception even forced Blizzard to replace most of the demo PCs featuring StarCraft with Diablo. External pressure further exacerbated the situation. At that time, it was rumored that 80 other RTS strategies were under development concurrently with StarCraft. Consequently, the market was highly competitive, and the developers simply couldn't afford to disappoint the audience, especially considering the high expectations for the company's new projects after the success of Warcraft 2. Fortunately, StarCraft was completely reworked. That's a story for another time, but the Orcs in Space build was lost forever, with only a few rare frames remaining. Warcraft 3 also underwent
Okay.
significant transformations, and not just once. Just a couple of videos ago, I mentioned that Warcraft 3, or rather, Warcraft Legends, Blizzard's cancelled project, was initially hero-centric. Instead of building a base, you focused on controlling a hero and a handful of units. The camera wasn't free. Instead, it was fixed behind the character. Thanks to a person under the nickname Hallfire.
Sounds like World of Warcraft. It sounds like this was the initial part, like the initial development of WoW. It says it was fixed on a single hero rather than controlling units, and the camera was fixed behind the person. This sounds like literally early WoW development. That's probably why they canceled it.
Who preserved the footage. We can see how this looked in the actual game.
Right,
For
Cadence.
example, here's footage shot in early 2000. Instead of the familiar bottom menu with character stats, there was a smaller panel with several abilities that changed depending on which NPC from your squad you selected. The camera was indeed fixed behind the hero, and units automatically followed them. An Alliance squad is shown attacking an Orc base, whose buildings were, firstly, larger in appearance than the buildings in the released version of the game. Secondly, they differed somewhat in design. In some old interviews from roughly the same period, which an archivist managed to preserve, the point about the sizes is also noticeable. In one segment, an Alliance knight was shown next to tents. The knight could easily fit completely inside, if that were an option. Now, compare those sizes with the modern Warcraft 3. It's immediately clear that the knight is slightly taller and longer than the tent.
Yeah.
So, thanks to these frames, it's evident that the environment was originally envisioned as being larger.
Did we just get like what is this? What is he talking about? Where's the WoW? I know it said Warcraft in the title, but I mean he started with WoW, then he went to StarCraft. orcs in space, and I don't know what the fuck's going. Okay, the unit's bigger than the tents. All right, I'll just let him. It looks like WoW's coming back. All right, here we go. Let's just let this play.
I've often discussed on this channel
Random
how
ass.
early versions of World of Warcraft significantly differed from what we eventually saw at launch. I'm not even talking about scrapped concepts like continents or islands that never made it into vanilla. Even the most familiar elements, such as graphics, the user interface, and effects, were entirely different. The game felt like a completely separate entity, simply wrapped in Warcraft's familiar aesthetic. Then, in 2020, we were incredibly fortunate to witness some extremely rare footage of World of Warcraft from 2002. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to a person named GT Xera, who miraculously managed to unearth a gameplay
what the
video
hell? Look
from
how
those
weird
early
that spell
years.
animation is.
Yes, it was recorded with what looks like a potato camera, but it's genuinely one of the best historical records we have. The differences from the released vanilla version are immediately
What the
striking.
heck?
The game appears to have superior visuals, at least in terms of its effects. They're more colorful, brighter, and significantly more animated.
I was gonna say, like, these effects for 2002 are actually pretty intense. I wonder if Blizzard like toned them back or toned them down a little bit to make this, the game more accessible. Because not everybody back then, gaming PCs were not a thing. You played on your dad's PC or your mom's PC. Like, you played on that family fucking computer potato piece of shit in your basement or your family room or the corner of your kitchen or whatever, because people didn't really have even offices in their homes back then. It was like the computers were in the weirdest places. I remember my friend had his in his kitchen. Ours was in our playroom. We had like a little playroom that my mom converted into a playroom for us as kids. Their PCs were always in weird places back then, and they sucked. So I think maybe Blizzard toned this down to make this more accessible, like I said, to just like the layman's PC.
And complex compared to what players would experience 2 years later.
This is proof that
The
Samus is
glowing
pre-watched.
effect on the
True.
weapon, held by the player-controlled mage, creates the impression that it was intensely bright and
Not the
flaming,
computer kitchen,
like a
yeah.
torch.
The
The
kitchen
interface
computer.
itself was also distinct. The inventory menu, the appearance of the minimap, and even the ability and health point displays were different,
16
resembling
slot
those
bag?
found in more classic
Yeah,
MMO
what the heck?
games. A little later, the same individual published another video from the
Look at this
Warcraft
look at this human model. What the heck's going on with this thing? It's got huge feet, big fat bicep. It looks like a early Cultiran.
Alpha, but this time from 2003. The differences from vanilla were fewer, but still present. For example, you can see that instead of the standard default human NPCs, other variations were occasionally
Oh,
used,
wow.
like this rather portly flight master.
Portly. That's one way to put it. Yeah, wow. These look like Cultiran models.
Generally, the game files contain many diverse human models that perhaps better conveyed their essence. In Old Hillsbrad, revisited in later
Fair maiden,
expansions,
yes.
you could spot old models, originally meant for vanilla but never used. How did so much change in just 1 year? Why did the
Is
developers
Achilles in chat? This looks like his wife. Okay, I'll let
much
this go.
change in just 1 year? Why did the developers remove genuinely beautiful effects?
I don't know why
The main
I just thought
assumption
that.
is that the developers aim to attract as many people as possible to their project. This meant ensuring that both those with powerful computers and those with more modest setups could play the game. Therefore, simplifying the effects likely reduced the system requirements somewhat. And
I think that's
I'd
what they were
also
going for.
hypothesize it eased the workload on the animators. We already know that the animators were
He streams all the time. His wife shows up on stream. That's why I said that. But the whole drawback of graphics to make it more playable on the PC, on any PC, was probably one of the best decisions they ever made. Because WoW became the everyman's game. Like, where EverQuest was really like for super, it's so niche, it's so nerdy, it's so over the top compared to anything else that existed back then. And then WoW comes around, it's like, hey, regular people, why don't you try this game? Why don't you try something called an MMO? And that's what really took off for World of Warcraft, was they just became the everyman's MMO.
We already know that the animators were incredibly overwhelmed and barely managed to complete a host of other crucial tasks before the game's release. In the context of lost and forgotten footage from old Warcraft, it's essential to mention the Alpha Project. I've brought it up several times in previous videos when discussing cut content. In short, this ambitious community-driven effort aims to recreate World of Warcraft's Alpha version 0.5.3. This is one of the few early versions of Warcraft that was actually leaked online. While having the
Wow.
leaked client is fantastic, filling it with content has to be done almost from scratch. This includes countless mechanics, features, and more. Therefore, the creators of this project began archiving all possible data from Warcraft's alpha and beta eras. To date, they've managed to collect over 20,000 old screenshots, dozens of videos, and more. This is truly a Herculean task.
Damn.
Well, let's start with the most basic question.
What's going
on?
on?
How do they even search?
Is the staff in the Tauren's hand while he's flying? You guys see this? It looks like he's holding the staff while he's flying. Yeah, he is. It's not on his back. It's in front of him.
This is truly a Herculean
so scuffed.
task. Well, let's start with the most basic question. How do they even search for this stuff? It's logical to assume that screenshots from, say, 2002
They should release the
were
alpha
originally
build.
published in the
Be
early
broken.
2000s on various fan sites, forums, and official or unofficial sources. However, many of those fan sites from the early 2000s have long since shut down, possibly even over a decade and a half ago. The Wayback Machine, a site that allows saving snapshots of web pages, certainly improves the situation, but not always. So, literally every year, it becomes harder to find ancient screenshots, or even more so, videos. I'd venture to say that the Alpha Project is currently the largest endeavor dedicated to archiving Warcraft's early days. Let's take a look at some of the forgotten, lost things they've managed to unearth. We'll start with death, a fundamental function. What happens after death now? You leave your body, appear at a graveyard, and either run back to your corpse to resurrect, or resurrect immediately at a spirit healer, incurring a debuff. Spirit healers were initially visible to both the dead and the living. Moreover, they appeared as ordinary races, not as the—
What the heck is that? That looks like a weird Medivh model or something.
ordinary races, not as the ethereal angels we know today. It wasn't until patch 0.6 that they became ghosts visible only to the deceased. Graveyards themselves, by the way, didn't even exist. Instead, there were meeting stones.
Oh my
Players
God,
would bind themselves to a specific stone.
You'd bind yourself to a stone, and this guy lost, you lose experience from dying. So this was like an EverQuest thing. EverQuest used to lose gear and shit. It'd be like a big problem if you died. This losing experience was probably considered to be like a much softer thing, and then eventually they just caused armor damage instead, which was a better choice than experience loss. That would be annoying.
Players would bind themselves to a specific stone in a zone and would reappear there upon death. Interestingly, they also discovered that you could lose experience upon dying. At a certain point, altars could have served as alternatives to meeting stones. Yes, much like those found in the Warcraft strategy games. Here's how the Horde and Alliance versions looked. One of the most fascinating rediscoveries made by members of the Alpha Project concerned the trading system. I talked about this in a video a few years ago. The core idea was this: the auction house didn't exist, but players still wanted to trade, sell items, and earn gold. How could they do it? As it turned out, it was through add-ons. They published their finding on Reddit and described how, to their surprise, while browse old screenshots, they found a primitive auction system that operated via an add-on. They dug deeper and discovered a mention of an add-on with an auction system in a book by a former Warcraft developer. Following this thread, they managed to unearth this very add-on.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, they not only found it, but also an entire collection of add-ons from Cosmos UI, of which this trading add-on was a part. The Cosmos UI website has long been defunct, so it's a miracle they managed to dig up such ancient material.
One thing about add-ons too is now like we're all spoiled by you know, CurseForge and stuff, where you just like click update and okay, now my add-ons all up to date. That didn't used to be a thing. To get add-ons, you used to have to freaking know which folder to put it in. You had to click install, click on your WoW folder, click on your add-ons folder within the WoW folder. There was like a bunch of things you had to do to get to the correct folder and then put it in there. And then if there was an update, you just had to manually check all the time and make sure you had the most up-to-date version of your add-ons. Yeah, different world back then, man.
On some other screenshots, pay attention to the ability bars. We're accustomed to being able to add multiple bars in the settings to display necessary spells, macros, and so on. But this wasn't originally in the game either. It was also implemented through add-ons. Only much later, seeing that players simply couldn't fit all their spells on a single bar, developers decided to integrate the function of additional bars into the game itself. I'd also like to specifically highlight the old videos they discovered. Some of these were already known to the public, while others are extremely rare, including even the most basic gameplay videos from ordinary players. Players also found even more videos from 2002, so now we can enjoy not just the potato quality gameplay of a human mage, but at least a couple of other classes as well.
Damn, look at those abilities.
As we can see, other ability effects also stood out with their brightness and scale. They truly were larger, and, in some places, cooler than the vanilla versions.
Some of these are really cool.
The character selection screen in 2002 also differed significantly. What was it like in vanilla? Your character on the left, and the character selection box for the server on the
What
right.
the heck?
Back then, it wasn't like that. Both available characters were shown on the left and right, and in the center, a small window displayed the selected character's appearance. They also uncovered footage of how NPCs used to react to player emotes. If a player showed any negative emotion towards the citizens of Stormwind, those NPCs could literally walk up and kick the player in response. In
Why'd they get rid of that?
Warcraft has indeed come a long way, evolving significantly over the years. Many aspects have been changed beyond absolute recognition.
Was that a
shaping the game
lightsaber? I think it was an enchanted weapon, but yeah, close to
into
it.
what it is today. But it's also wonderful that players managed to capture these early moments on video, allowing us to glimpse what Blizzard's games were originally intended to be like and appreciate their original charm.
There's some cool stuff in here. Yeah, the spell effects are kind of mind-blowing in that they were... I mean, we're getting back to that now, right? It's like, oh, all these years later, spell effects are looking better, which causes a lot of lag, which I'm sure is part of the reason why they got rid of spell effects to that extent in regular WoW. Interesting, flying vehicles and Wintergrass, fun stuff. Yeah, this is a cool video. Interesting watch.